Today we're going to be learning about the lower course of the river. Now I split this topic into 3 subtopics, which is 1. Characteristics, 2. Processes, and 3. Landforms that you would find in this area of a river in the lower course. Right, now the characteristics. The river has a large volume and also a high rate of discharge. This means that the valley floor is pretty wide. However, the river's width only occupies a small part of the valley. So if this is the valley floor, then the river may occupy something like this. The main erosion here is lateral. And lateral erosion is sideways. So you have erosion here and erosion here. Often, the river will also meander throughout the floodplain. Okay, hopefully you should now have a sound understanding of the characteristics of a river in the lower course. Now, going on to processes. Now the main process here, or the second main process, is transportation, because we still need to transport the sediment and the load down to the mouth of the river and then eventually into the sea. The 2 main types you see here is suspension, which is when the sediment is suspended in the river, like this, and also solution, where it is just a solution in the river and often invisible to the naked eye. Now, moving on, after this you have the deposition. Now this is where the load is deposited, usually during a flood. Now remember, the largest material needs more energy to move it, so it's deposited first. So, if your large material is here, your medium material is here, and your small tiny bits of sediment are here, this is the process of deposition. Brilliant. You should now have a good, sound understanding and knowledge of the processes in the lower course of the river. Finally, we move on to the landforms in the lower course of the river. Now, possibly the main landform here is the floodplain. Now, the floodplain is the area around the river in the lower course. However, it is also the area that is covered in times of flood. So in times of flood, the river will burst its banks and the river will spill out onto the floodplain. Now, the floodplain, as you can see, is very wide, but also what you won't be able to see is that it's also very fertile. Now, this is due to the rich alluvium, or as we know it, sediment, being deposited by the river. This means the floodplain is great for building, say, houses or fishmongeries, because it means you can do fishery or even just grow crops because the land and soil is just so fertile here. However, it is also very prone to flooding, so often buildings will either be flooded or just swept off the floodplain altogether. Second main landform is also levees. Now, levees are often constructed after the build-up of alluvium, which can create them. And now this normally happens during times of flood, when the flood bursts its banks, i.e. gets higher and spills onto the floodplain. However, also bringing with it the sediment, so the sediment is moved up onto the floodplain as well. Now, as we learnt earlier, heaviest material is always dropped first, because it takes more energy to move it. Now, this, as a consequence, the repeated flooding causes over time natural walls of sediment to be built up, as the largest material, here and here, is deposited first, and then so on with medium and small. Now, over time, as I said, if this happens lots of times, you'll actually get natural walls being built up, so much that the river forms a natural defence against flooding. Now, these are levees, and they raise the height of the riverbank. This is something key to remember. The final type of landform at the lower course of the river that you're going to need to know for your GCSE is deltas. Now, deltas are quite tricky because there's several different types, but hopefully I can teach you them and then you can revise them later on. A bit of background on deltas. They're found at the mouth of rivers, and deltas are formed when the river deposits material faster than the sea can remove it. That's when the river deposits material faster than the sea can remove it. Now, the first type of delta I'm going to show you is the arcuate delta. Now, this is when the land around the river mouth arches out into the sea, and the river splits many times, creating almost a fan effect. An example of an arcuate delta would be the Niger Delta in Africa. Now, moving on, the second type of delta that you'll need to know is the cuspate delta. Now, this is when land around the river mouth juts out almost like an arrow into the sea to look something like this. An example of a cuspate delta would be the Ebro Delta. Moving on finally, the final one you'll need to know is the Birdsfoot Delta. This is when the river splits on the way to the sea, and each part of the river just juts out, much like a bird's foot. Do not confuse this with the Arcuate Delta. This is when the river splits many times, creating a fan effect. The bird's foot simply splits at the top and does not split further on. Well, now we can tick off landforms. So, for the lower course of the river, you should now have a solid knowledge of characteristics, processes and landforms. I hope you've learned a lot from this video, and thanks for watching.